Well, ironically, the election of this year was the same day as when I passed my PhD viva. So I was busy celebrating while Americans were going to the polls, and many of them ended up voting for Donald Trump. So when I woke up the next day realizing that Trump had won, it was definitely a disappointment for me, because I felt that my research was hopefully something which was going to contribute to climate change being in a better situation than it is right now. But Trump is definitely a step in the wrong direction. His discourse on climate change has been really problematic, and it's worrying to consider what he may roll back on in terms of action towards dealing with climate change. So specifically, he has called for, he's been very sceptical about the importance of climate change as an issue overall. He's likened it to a Chinese hoax, and has made jokes about climate change which make it seem as if it's not a real issue. He's also threatened to come out of the Paris climate change agreement, and if he were to do that, I think that would be a real step backwards internationally. But let me say, I don't think that he will actually go through with that for a couple of reasons. I think that he will stay in Paris, the Paris Agreement, because it takes 3 years to actually remove yourself as a country from the Paris Agreement, plus an extra year. So it's effectively 4 years. So even if he decided to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement, they would still be in for the first term of his presidency. So it would make him look rather weak. He would also bring a lot of international opposition upon the United States, and probably bring a lot of domestic opposition as well from civil society groups and environmental groups. He could potentially withdraw from the UN architecture entirely and come out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But again, that's going to create an awful lot of international opposition. It's going to create a lot of domestic opposition. And I think the United States will want to keep a seat at the table at the United Nations. So more realistically, what I see Trump doing is rolling back on all sorts of provisions domestically on climate change issues. So a lot of the executive actions that President Obama put in place, we're going to look at President Trump rolling those back. And that's a huge backward step in terms of climate change mitigation, because the priority to reduce emissions in a rapid fashion is as great as it ever was. But Trump doesn't seem to recognize this. So that's a big backward step, but I think also they'll draw back on the commitments that they've made under the Paris Agreement. So while I expect them to the United States still to be in Paris, I think that we will see a scaling back on their ambition. And this can include things like the amount of money that the United States pledges towards climate change finance. So one of the big issues in negotiations is how to provide sufficient finance for developing countries who are facing the impacts of climate change to adapt to those impacts, and even to provide compensation for loss and damage that climate change has already created. So it's a question of responsibility of those more developed countries who have greater capacity and also have greater responsibility for creating the climate change issue to provide that kind of finance. Now, for years, the amount of finance pledged has not been big enough, and provided, again, not even big enough, or as big as what's been pledged. But I think Donald Trump probably will provide even less.